Good morning. Thanks for coming out at 9 a.m. to spend the morning talking with me about drones and what it means right now and how rapidly the technology is growing. I just want to have a disclaimer real quick. I don't work for a drone company. I don't work for a regulator. I'm a software engineer, just like you. And I've been flying drones now for about 6 years and looking into them for about 8. I fly this guy everywhere, and some of the footage you saw earlier was the Faroe Islands, where this guy was able to go against almost gale force winds just at this size, and how far things have come. I personally do it recreationally because I find it really fun. I was introduced to drones because of photography and video, but actually I'm in the minority of what drones are used for now. And that is rapidly becoming the case. Although looking at old films and the way that they were done originally was very exciting, to see the entire film crew hanging like from the side of a helicopter. It's not very practical now. It's also not very green to use fuel for that. And it's just a lot louder in a helicopter than it is in a drone, even though these guys can sound like very loud insects. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of the technology behind how they're going to keep the skies safe, not just in this country, but in many different countries with the introduction of remote ID, and just a little bit about the why. The reason that's important is because that industry is growing so quickly now that there's going to be a demand for software engineers to come in and understand how to build dashboards for them and systems for them, which is exciting for me. The second half, though, is much more fun. It's pretty much you sitting with me almost in my living room and getting to watch several different fun videos of the new tech coming out. Does that sound good? Cool. All right. All right. So let's talk about the rise of drones. It's only really happened over the past 15 years or so. It's hard to believe that's the case. About in 2006, that is when the Federal Aviation Authority in the United States gave its first commercial drone permit to a company. And that was, of course, right around the time that Amazon was telling everybody that this was going to be the future. But it took all the way to 2011 before any sort of permits were given for agriculture. Now, this is one of the biggest areas of use for drones because much like in this country, in the United States, we have so much space to cover. And it is often easier to do it with an unmanned aerial vehicle to monitor, but also to spray crops, etc. And in 2015, one of my personal favorite ways that the application was used was for search and rescue with combinations of different kinds of like LiDAR technology and infrared, so that you could find children who were lost at night on hiking expeditions. But by 2017 in the US, we had over 1 million drones registered. And when I say registered, there are plenty of drones that are not registered. But by then, that was officially on the books with the FAA. In 2019, Wing was the very first commercial drone delivery service. And that was its first time it actually took like a paid contract. And so now we're getting a little bit closer to now, right? In 2021, 1 in 10 Australians owned a drone. And they've figured that just in the past couple of years, it's probably more like 1 in 7. So this country loves their drones. And just last year, remote ID as a regulation in the United States was supposed to take effect by September, but it was delayed because not enough manufacturers had actually been able to deliver modules for people to retrofit their drones with it. And in June, that's when Australia's CASA, which is Civil Aviation, I think, Authority, I'm going to say it incorrectly. Thank you, Civil Aviation Safety Authority, opened public consultation to ask you all, well, how do you feel about remote ID? Do you want to have any commentary about any concerns or suggestions about it? And it only remained open for 30 days and closed in July. In October of last year, the FAA in the United States approved Zipline to fly beyond visual line of sight, and this was huge. Up until now, no company, commercial or otherwise, was allowed to have an unmonitored visual drone. That meant that in order for them to do deliveries, they would have to have some sort of a truck with a bunch of these drones in a neighborhood, and then they could launch them from there, which kind of defeated the purpose of being able to do longer range deliveries. So this was a really big deal, and most of these things are granted in a company by company basis. There was no regulation that was a blanket, okay? So they had to work for 7 years, the FAA, to get this exemption. And in November, in the UK, the CAA finally opened their request for consultation to see how the public felt about drones that were trackable. What's coming up now, this year, is that remote ID will be active by March in the United States, finally, because they have enough modules that have been manufactured and available. And the UK will be closing their consultation phase in the next month. And eventually, the Australian government will review the public feedback and take action on it. But I know that they are taking a little bit more time to figure out what would make the most sense from a regulatory standpoint. So when I said, me flying this guy around is not the main application, then what is? I'm sure none of this will really surprise many of you, but as I started looking into it, I was surprised just about how much there was outside of recreation. So inspection drones have become very important, especially in areas that are quite hot or quite cold, and inspecting things on towers that require people to be in harnesses and have ropes attached to them, and sweltering conditions or very cold conditions is actually quite dangerous to the health of the workers. And it has become important to have more ruggedized, like autonomous options for that. When we say autonomous, we don't really mean like thinking all by itself. We really just means that it's able to go and do the work of monitoring and getting very close, just like a worker could do by taking pictures of what they're seeing. Mapping drones are all about land surveillance, because there's so much in the real estate world also changing hands very quickly, redrawing of boundary lines. This is the much faster way to do it than by hand on the ground. Delivery drones are exploding, and this country is a really big proponent of that. Then it's photography. So that's the fourth in line, which I thought was really interesting. And of course, who doesn't love the racing drones? They took over social media by storm, showing flying under chairs and being able to go into bowling alleys. And they're really cool. They're very fast. And it's a very interesting machine. Right now, racing drones are hand-built. There's only a couple that were manufactured for the masses, right? But you would never win with them because you wouldn't be able to tweak them, much like an actual race car, at Le Mans, right? So racing drones are their own beast, and operators in different countries have different rules about what racing drones can be done. The safest way is to find an enormous warehouse and just let them race inside. And then you don't worry about airspace. But if you want to see something very cool, like maybe going up to the top of the Westfield Tower here, and going around it, that requires a lot of close work with the CASA, with CASA, and FAA in the United States to get exemptions for that, because they're so fast. They're just there and gone. And they're very small, which means they usually don't do much damage to anything but themselves if they roll kind of into a rock. But at certain speeds, it can become very concerning for wildlife, like other birds. So as more and more of these have gone around, there have been concerns from people who are not technical about what the heck they are, right? Some of them look quite scary, just like a big insect or a dragon or something. It depends especially on the size. I feel like this is pretty benign looking little guy. He's also one of the quietest drones in the market. This is a Mini 3 Pro. But the larger they are, the more sound they make, because that's just how it works. And especially if you live in the country, or you live in a lot and you are seeing a lot of agricultural work done, you will hear them and you won't even understand really what they are. And so there's lots of questions about, well, can they see into my backyard? Are they going to chase me down the street? What's happening with this? Now, we all know that we're the ones in general who program it to do what we need it to do. Sometimes someone's physically at the controls, but other times it will execute a pre-programmed route, okay? Just like your Tesla, sort of. And it'll go around and it'll have different sensors that will avoid things. But what it can't see is a person in the distance deciding to shoot it down, right? It's not going to be able to detect that. It's just going to be doing its job, going around taking pictures of trees or whatever it's doing. And it's really not truly a threat to other people, right? That's what they all say. Well, the current state of things is that we've gotten really excited about building them and putting them out in the wild. This is definitely a test and production kind of an experience for a lot of the companies. I'm going to use drone light shows as an example. In Melbourne, there was all sorts of different drone light shows that were asked to come in. Same thing in Perth, right? And sometimes these things don't go according to plan. We all know that. And sometimes it's just that it gets disconnected from its signal. What happens then? Does it fly away? Does it fall? Does it hover, stay where it is in the middle of a sequence? And in the case of Australia, about 50 of them just fell into the Yarra River. And you're like, oh, that's not good, right? You're thinking 50 drones, that's awful. And they had to have divers to go get them. But when you know how many of those drones were actually flying, there was 800 of them. So if you look at the percentage, that's not that bad. But we're still having to work that out. The same thing with every piece of software that we write. You're not always going to be able to write every edge case in your testing. And Mother Nature is a little bit of a beast. And she can decide to suddenly have a straight line wind out of nowhere that can push, your hardware. And you just have to deal with overcoming physics in a split second. The fact that we can do this at all with software is fascinating. So there's still, understandably, a little bit of hesitation about how safe things are to do. The good news about this kind of thing is that shows like that are almost always done with no people below because it's, for lack of a better term, they really are just dumb drones. Like they just are following a pre-programmed light show just like you would if you're going to a concert and you have actuating motors just on a big spotlight. It's the same thing. So they can't do nearly what this little guy could do. So it all depends. But regardless, people who are non-technical that are in politics definitely have things to say about making sure that things are safe. So they always come to us, the software engineer, to fix the problem. We need to know who these drones are, where they are, and if we can stop them, we can identify them. So what is remote ID? Does anybody here fly traditional aircraft or Microsoft Flight Sim? Maybe? Okay, one. In manned aircraft and flying, we have something on most aircraft called a transponder. And if you open up Flight Radar 24 around Sydney Airport, you can certainly see exactly which planes are coming and their current altitude and speed and their identification, right, their tail number. There is nothing like that for drones. But it has been suggested that we have something like this. Transponders are too large and too heavy, especially for the smaller drones, to carry. Also, they would need so much more power just to have the transponder be able to be used than what's on board the actual drone. So how do you do that? So there's a couple of different ways that the industry has looked at it. And this did start in the United States because every state is kind of like its own country, and they all have their own opinions about how to do things. I'm sure it's much the same in Australia, each of your states. So the real question was, how do we know if this is a friend or foe? How do we know if this is somebody just in a park, playing around with the drone that they got for Christmas, versus this is somebody who's just being weird and trying to spy on somebody? How do we know if at a big soccer game or a football match that this drone belongs to your broadcasting company who's just trying to do a nice flyover shot of the stadium versus somebody who's trying to cause trouble and just go into the game? Right? That seems really frustrating. The same thing with what happens if you live near the airport within 5.5 kilometers. Then you can't fly at all if you are a recreational flyer. And that's kind of frustrating because even if you just only go up and down in your own backyard, because you're somewhere near the flight and arrival path, that's going to be quite dangerous. Not just actually for the manned aircraft that are coming down that can't see it, but also for your poor drone who in no way can handle the vortices coming off the back of these aircraft. It'll blow it right away into a building. So suddenly we've grown from giving this to your 8-year-old kid for their birthday into something like, oh, this is like actual aviation you have to know about. In the States, in order to fly and many different areas, you have to take an extensive test that includes understanding how to read different charts, wind speeds, and dealing with radio communications with air traffic control. And that's not something your 8-year-old kid is going to do, right? Well, why is this? Because at this point, we are graduating from this being a fun toy into something that there's going to be so many of them around. How do we know that we're not going to run into each other, let alone other things in the sky? And what happens if our connection is broken? So really, this is a software issue and a hardware issue. It's not so much about whether or not it can be done. It's just about those edge cases. So remote ID is supposed to be the reason, the answer, okay? So what remote ID is it provides real-time identification and tracking of drones during flight. So through a broadcast module, and it can be done on a couple of different channels in different ways. So those broadcast modules are things that can be retrofit on that expensive $25,000 filming drone that you have for your business, your side business, because you don't want to have to get rid of it because it doesn't by default have that it's already projecting, right? You want to be able to retrofit it. So having the availability of broadcast modules for remote ID would be very important. It has a network-based solution, but you can also use Wi-Fi for it as well, depending on the ability for it to go certain distances. And that is going to be governed by your regulator in your country. So this is the fun part for me as a developer, is that what is in there? What is in the payload of what remote ID is doing? It is a passive, it's basically just a passive amount of information that's being squawked at certain intervals, and those intervals, again, are going to be set by your regulator. You're going to say it needs to do this every half a second, every quarter of a second, however long we need those intervals to be. And it's going to have a payload, just like your JSON, of, okay, so here's me. I have an ID that is me as the hardware device. And here is the location I'm at this point in time. That will be altitude, and it will be speed as well. And then, of course, it will show where the controller person is on a map and GPS. At very least, there's also other things it could possibly include in squawking that, but that's roughly what it is. And the idea is that at least then law enforcement can see it on a screen. At least they can be like, oh, there's someone over there. They probably don't know that they shouldn't be straying into an arrival path at Sydney, right? So maybe we should just chat with them. And it's usually used just to help inform people and let them know, hey, you can't do this. Even in the States, that is known for its very opinionated law enforcement. They're usually always pretty good about saying, hey, just so you know, probably your drone didn't probably come with a manual about where you can fly and how you can fly. So you can't fly here, but you could do this over there. And they're almost always used just for informational purposes. And of course, this ensures that that drone is identifiable as not a threat. That, I think, is the most important part from every country. That's why remote ID needs to be implemented. So anybody here in the identity, has any of you here done any identity security work in application development? Okay, cool. So most of you. It's not enough just to authenticate. It's also to authorize which door can you open, where are you allowed to be. This would allow that to happen. Because then you could say, hey, these drones are police drones, and then they need to be in this area and they're allowed. But maybe this drone group is recreational flyers, so this is where they're allowed to fly. And then that would make it much easier for on a screen literally to have like a little blip that looks green versus one that's like definitely not supposed to be in that zone. The only way you would know is if this thing is squawking its ID and you know who it is, right? There's a couple of different ways, and I did not create this, so don't come at me for the drawing, but this is basically the way that remote ID applications work. You can actually make one yourself. There's several out there on GitHub repositories you can grab just to see how it works. I was interested to see if I can even see this guy up in the sky in a park, and how close does it need to be? In my case, it needed to be pretty close. I need to definitely see it visually in order for me to even pick it up in the app. But some of them will get longer and longer. There are, of course, physical things will get in the way, like the building across the street. I'm not going to be able to see through the building, but I will be able to see above it, right? So this is roughly the way that it can work. It can work on a couple of different channels. If you're interested more about the approach of the spec, because that's really what this is, you should go to drone-remote-id.com and you can find out more information about the technical implementation of what we're talking about. So what applications are there? Obviously, there's surveillance, and it's especially helpful to air traffic control. Why is this? Air traffic control has a wonderful radar screen that shows them where the departing and arriving aircraft are as long as they have a transponder. Most aircraft are required to have a transponder. Some of them are grandfathered in that are much older. But in general, they would rather have you have a transponder because then they can see that you strayed on a taxiway and you just turned the wrong way and they can help reroute you. And in this case, at least they could see, even if they're not communicating with the drone operator, they can at least see that there is a drone in the vicinity and they can tell an aircraft that is landing to not land and to go around because there's something that would be in the way. So it's very helpful for safety, for air traffic control. And of course, drone delivering packages is also a big thing. Remember how I talked about which drones are allowed and which ones are not? Wouldn't it be helpful if you were in a house with somebody who's not technical, who's like, oh, somebody's just flying a drone around there. You could just pull up an app and say, oh, it's the Amazon Prime delivery drone, it's fine. And you don't have to worry about it because at least you would identify which one it is. Right now, it's just visual and you may not know who owns it. Monitoring wildlife, this is a really big one. You have so much space in Australia and so many different kinds of wildlife that can be disturbed just by humans going in and trying to count. It's much easier to count herd numbers by drone and to stay far enough away where they can't actually even hear it, especially if it's a very small drone. But unfortunately, lots of people don't know that you can't fly in certain protected areas. So this would also help the rangers know, okay, this is just a wildlife drone that's specifically used for just monitoring purposes, and it's allowed to be here. Bridge inspections. This also would let people know whether or not that drone was allowed to even be near the Sydney Harbour Bridge to take a look at it. And of course, search and rescue. This way, especially during bushfires and flood events, is helpful to know whether or not that drone has flight capability and payload capability to help and can get sent to different places. So it's much easier to see on a radar between different departments. So not just the department that has the drone, but perhaps and a medical department that also wants to know should they clear the way or stay out of the way of landing drones. So these are definitely benefits, right? You get more situational awareness, prevention of mid-air collisions, some quick incident response, and you can actually have somewhat of a shared airspace with manned aircraft. As somebody who is spending a lot of time now also looking into doing manned aircraft and flying, again, Microsoft Flight Sim for the win, I can't imagine having to dodge a whole bunch of Amazon Prime delivery drones because they strayed into a path, or the same thing with just somebody who didn't mean anything by it, but was just trying to capture a photo or a video for TikTok. It's difficult because this is such a fun device to fly. It really is. But as somebody who is physically in a device that flies, it can be very concerning because you can't talk to it. You say, get out of my path, I'm flying here. So how do we prevent that? Especially with so many of them being owned by just civilians, let alone companies, how do we share the airspace? So not only does it enhance safety, but at this point, it's just required by at least 2 regulators globally, and that's the FAA in the United States and the European Aviation Safety Authority in the EU. So anything over the size of this drone is already required to have remote ID, and that's just the new rule, because that way they can at least assist civilians with where they're allowed to be, and it becomes much easier to be able to regulate safety. All right, so let's talk about the concepts of this. There's a direct broadcast that works with it, and network remote ID. Those are the two main types. One of them uses Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and the other one can use just like your phone, right? Can just use some of those towers. And I know what you're thinking. Oh, it's already hard to get a signal in some places with my phone. Why would I want a bunch of drones also using it? It actually would be an additional signal. This is an infrastructure requirement that would be added to the tower. So it's not something that you would have to worry about crowding that. And yeah, cellular network, yes. So there are some challenges with this, as you can imagine. It kind of requires figuring out how to build that infrastructure. And there is a limited broadcast range. If any of you actually looked at the broadcasting range of Bluetooth, it's not very far. I've tried though. I've sometimes left one device I was listening to and just tried to walk across the room, and it didn't go super well. So how is that supposed to help when a drone is flying higher? So range of transmissions will become very important, and each regulator will get to decide which of the transmission types are going to be allowed. And it's also difficult because in this guy, in the United States, I don't have to have remote ID. I don't have to have them at all. They don't really care. It's pretty small. It's not really going to hurt people much because it's just very lightweight and they're not worried about it. But this shipped with remote ID on by default from the manufacturer. So there are people who may want to turn it off. It's very difficult. Some of them are configured by just having a different size battery. Some of them you have to go into the software, turn them off, or some of them have no ability to disable it. So that's where some of this comes in, is that maybe you get a drone that doesn't have it already broadcasting and you can just add it to it. This is usually used in the event of a larger drone that can handle the payload difference, okay? So much to think about the really nice Mavic, right? The really big DJI that's really nice. Autel also has one. And the reason it took so long for the US regulators to be able to mandate it is because manufacturing these takes time. And the manufacturers all said, we've got it. Don't worry, we'll be ready. Do you think that happened? It's always difficult. So instead what happened is that the amount of orders they expected to get based on the information they had about commercial and civilian drone owners was incorrect by about 4 times. Imagine that they ship all over the world. So that means that Europe was also interested in these modules. Australia will become interested in these modules depending on how that passes, and of course the UK. So it's a great time if you want to do a startup for remote ID modules, let me tell you. This is kind of what the payload looks like if you're interested. This comes from Drone Scanner, which is an open spec. If you're interested, it's an open source spec. And if you look, this just kind of shows you, much like Flight Radar, where did the drone come from? Where did it go? And it just shows the different IDs that it can have. And this can refresh whatever interval you want to set. The biggest concern, especially in the United States, is understandably privacy. Do you want someone to know where the operator is, the person who's operating it? It depends on who you are. Has anybody here ever flown a drone? Yeah, awesome. Most of the time, when I'm flying this guy, they're like, oh, that's so cool. Can I see what it sees? Because of course, this one has a really nice camera on it. And that's fun. But sometimes people are afraid of it and they don't really know why you're flying it. This includes times where you might have a high-vis vest on that says commercial drone operator because you're doing something like just taking pictures of a house for a real estate listing or doing a roof inspection. Very useful. We actually use this guy to do a roof inspection on our own house because I noticed driving by that maybe something was a little off, and my husband just flew it up and flew real close, took some good pictures and sent it to the roofer. They're like, oh, yeah, it'll cost this much. They didn't have to have the person even come out and have new pictures because we actually got close enough. It's pretty cool. But some people get very angry because they just don't understand this flying computer and what you in particular are doing in and around their neighborhood or their property. So you can see how understanding where the system operator could be, unless you're law enforcement, can be a concern, right? Especially if you're just doing a job that you are paid to do. Yep. Well, some of these companies that are building drone like monitoring apps, right, will actually suppress where the operator is. Maybe not where the drone is, but where the operator is, unless you're law enforcement. Law enforcement will probably want to talk to you if you are straying into airspace that's not yours to be in, but other ones are not. So just keep aware that at this point, there is no authentication protocol for this, that only certain people see it, unless the app you build does that, right? This thing will still squawk all of that data everywhere it goes, which is why this is the conversation the UK and Australia are having about how do you feel about the drones that you're flying, like having so much information about them. As somebody who flies all the time, I actually don't mind this, because if I can build an app that can see my own drone, that means I can see the other one over there and I don't stray into their path. But my intent does not equal everyone's intent. Understand? Good. All right. Now that we have all looked at this, it's an interesting graph. Let's go to the next one. So what you're hearing is me repeat safety. Again, I don't work for the government. That's not my thing. But I understand why you would want to have a system to allow and deny, just like your allow and deny list in certain airspaces, right? So unfortunately for everyone, when you go on vacation and you leave a country that you're in where you know the drone laws, that may not apply at all to you. The good news is that there is a global regulatory body that does this for the rest of the aviation sector, right? We have agreements so that we can fly over other countries, in between countries and land. We have nothing for drones. But this is what will allow us to probably draw that map, but not until the individual regulators in those countries kind of come to a decision about it. Because what would that look like to fly between, my goodness, what would be a good one? At least in the States, I always use that as an example. What does it look like to fly over the border from the United States to Canada? The answer is you don't do that because the regulatory bodies are just different between those countries. But what if it could be helpful, especially for those who are using these drones for search and rescue in like what wilderness territories where you have a lot of those kinds of borders, or even in the States, like in Australia, what is like West Australia want to do versus the North, right? You want to have some sort of agreement. But if you don't even agree on which of these broadcast types you want, that's kind of difficult to track, right? So that's where we are in terms of everything being in flux. But they are pretty shored up in the United States now and in the EU. They're just like, we're just doing this and we're going to go forward from there. That's what that regulatory landscape looks like. In the US, in order to even fly anything larger than this in populated areas, you have to have a Part 107 official pilot's license. It's quite extensive, and there's entire courses out like Pilot Institute on how to do this. The amount of knowledge you get from that is mind-blowing. It is at least partway to an actual manned aircraft pilot's license, fixed wing. So if you wanted to test and see how good your memory is, that's a great test to take. But EASA in Europe also has like a separate test you can take just for unmanned aerial systems. And they are always updating their opinion on remote ID at this point monthly on to what they can do with it. It's an excellent time to be in the software industry specifically for this. And of course, in the UK, they're researching more on what to do with remote ID, but it is probably going to be implemented by the end of the year. We already talked a little bit about privacy concerns, different regulations, and enforcement. This is the best introduction I've ever seen.
In fact, there are more drones being flown above backyards, parks, and beaches than ever before. More drones in the sky means it's important that we all understand the rules that keep you and others around you safe, on the ground and in the air. Here are the rules that you need to know before takeoff. When your drone is up in the air, you can never fly your drone over anyone. This includes places like festivals, sporting events, populated beaches, busy roads, and pedestrians on footpaths. And when there are people around, your drone has to be at least 30 meters away from them, unless the other person is helping control or navigate the drone. You can only fly one drone at a time, and that drone can't go any higher than 120 meters. That's 400 feet, or about the length of a football field. Drones may be aircraft, but they can't fly anywhere near major airports. If your drone weighs more than 250 grams, you must fly at least 5.5 kilometers away from a controlled airport, which generally have a control tower at them. If you're near a helicopter landing site or smaller aerodrome without a control tower, you can fly your drone within 5.5 kilometers. You can only do this if crewed aircraft are not operating in the area, if you're not within the airport itself, or flying in areas where aircraft will arrive and depart, known as the approach or departure paths. If you become aware of crewed aircraft nearby, you'll have to maneuver away and land your drone as quickly and safely as possible. Drones aren't nocturnal creatures. You can only fly your drone during daylight hours, and you mustn't fly in cloud or fog. You must keep it within your visual line of sight. This means being able to navigate, orientate, and see your drone with your own eyes at all times, not through a device like a video screen or goggles. And you can't fly your drone over or near an area affecting public safety or where emergency operations are underway. This applies to situations like road accidents, bushfires, firefighting efforts, police activity, and search and rescue. If drones do get in the way in these situations, lives may be put at risk. Breaking the rules can also land you in trouble. You can be fined or even taken to court. Drones are fun, and by following these simple rules, we can all enjoy the air together. For more information about where you can and can't fly, go to CASA's website and download a CASA verified app.
Yeah, so that's pretty brief, but it's a lot to remember for a recreational flyer. This is probably the best example of all the regulators I've seen. It's a very long, drawn-on one that we have in the States. There isn't much of one in the UK. European Union depends on the country that you're in as to whether or not they have one in your language, but it can actually have a lot of information. But the path forward is we need to at least know who owns that and whether or not it's supposed to be there. But the challenges kind of remain as hobbyists. The good news is, I think now, because we will have remote ID, it'll allow us to be able to basically make lanes or at least time-based flight possible. So like right now, you're not supposed to fly like directly over the Opera House, right? But maybe you could on Tuesday morning from 8 to 8:30 a.m. because they could say, all right, airspace is open for this. And that means that they could also work with all the other drones that may be police monitoring drones, search and rescue, to be away at those times. It's almost like air traffic, but just for drones. If you're interested in the official specs for this, casa.gov.au/drones. You also have a drones.gov.au site as well. But pretty much has the information that I gave you today. And there's the same one for EASA and, of course, the UK. So by 2025, we actually are probably going to see autonomous air taxis. That is something that's already starting to do test flights in New York City right now, just to see if they can do it without it costing so much fuel and trying to reduce the carbon footprint. There's a lot of helicopters that fly all around New York City, but they're trying to see if they could do it with just battery operated, which is very exciting. But by 2030, they definitely think that the majority of package delivery will be implemented to go farther beyond just what you can see. And drone swarms will probably be used with different large language models and artificial intelligence to go to the areas where they're most needed at the time, specifically thinking of getting weather data in, because you have sudden rain here, right, out of nowhere. It can at least monitor the weather and to know when to ground them and when to go up, when to go around, and be able to drop payloads of things like water, for bushfires, etc. All right. There was a study done just about a year ago that talked really about the practical aspects. That white paper is really interesting. Grab that URL if you're interested in it. It just talks about the open challenges that everybody runs into from a technology standpoint. Battery life is always the issue. There has not been a good enough solar module fitted to these, although it would be certainly useful, especially in Western Australia where you get lots of sun, to actually keep them going long enough to be useful in commercial application. And of course, just like many pieces of IoT, it's vulnerable to cybersecurity attacks, much less so now than it used to be, but that is still, of course, a threat. And the future trends involving adopting large language models to run these is also something that needs to be a consideration because it's already happening. Startups are already doing it. So instead of saying, oh, we got to put the cat back in the bag, it's already out. So now how do we do it as software professionals and as security professionals? So now we get to talk about the fun stuff of where things are going. So now that we kind of know, hopefully, who the drones are and who's allowed to operate them and if they're allowed in the airspace, what can we do now? Huge amounts of land is actually already being monitored on other planets by drones that were riding along in a little module with them and sending things back. It's not just like the rovers that you're seeing on Mars. These are also flying machines that are having to take into consideration different density of atmosphere. It's pretty cool. Of course, lots of thermal imaging is also being done. Drones were also used to image all of like the coast north of Gold Coast, just to kind of see how the Great Barrier Reef is doing and how hot the water was in each given month. And of course, mapping planned wind farms out, right? So these do more than just fly around looking to see if there's a broken piece. It actually will image how that thing is operating in real time. Something really cool that's also being done is just doing more for like the power situations that are happening in the UK. It's much easier when they have massive amounts of weather to send out these drones to all the known areas that could be at risk. I live in the United States. Right in the middle, we have lots of tornadoes, right? And sometimes in no time at all, we can have a huge windstorm blow through and that can affect the trees that then blow into each of our power stations. How long do you think it takes each group to go and check on all of these? Quite a bit of time. But if you had an autonomous swarm, they could just go up and go to each of their stations and bring back data immediately so that they could identify much quicker which of these areas need to be fixed. And
soon this might be a common sight off our coast. From a distance, it could be a plane, but look closer and it's something else entirely. Drones which can fly for hours, covering more than 100 kilometres at high speeds.
It's opened up from being a drone that you take out to the beach and take a couple of photos to now being something that can be deployed from anywhere in the world and would be comparable to a military system.
And they'll be used by Surf Lifesavers in a new trial on the North Coast next month in partnership with the state government. 4 drone providers put to the test at Evans Head.
Run them through scenarios in search and rescue and shark detection and emergency response.
Building on the existing fleet of more than 200 drones patrolling beaches, even assisting other agencies flying into emergencies away from the coast.
We can also remotely control these from further afield, so we don't need to be necessarily at the fire front or in the flood situation. One
of them, Elbit Systems, has been used in defence around the world, launched by a slingshot. Another is Wollongong startup Flight Technologies, which takes off like a helicopter but flies like a plane with a high-res zoom camera.
We can automatically detect people in the water. We can automatically detect boats.
This is one of the drones that we put to the test, and while it looks like a giant toy, it's one impressive piece of kit. One of these costs anywhere between $75 to $150,000. $1,000.
If this is a successful trial, which I imagine it will be, then they'll be certainly looking at making a bigger investment into this.
Whatever the future holds,
Oops. Sorry about that. Very exciting. And that was just in this past month or so. So that's all just happening right here. But there's also digital twins. Are you all familiar with the concept of digital twins? Okay, cool. That is primarily what is also being done at some of these like imaging sessions for power stations and new locations for where they might put a stadium or just take a look at what is currently there. That's probably the fastest way.
This video was taken near the eye of a Category 4 hurricane in the middle of the Atlantic, with waves as high as a 4-story building and winds reaching 94 miles an hour. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is sending 3 state-of-the-art drones, each with its own important mission, straight into the center of these monster storms.
The drones are a new piece of technology that is helping us uncover information about the storms that we didn't know before.
Let's take a look inside NOAA's lab to see how the agency uses drones to dive, sail, and fly into parts of a hurricane where humans could never go. At the laboratory, a team of NOAA engineers work on this torpedo-shaped drone called a glider. It's 5 feet long, can weigh up to 150 pounds, and it's controlled by drone pilots like Yuli Rivero.
A glider could cost anywhere from $175,000 to $200,000, depending on what sensors they're equipped with.
Those sensors are used to track storms half a mile beneath the ocean surface, measuring water temperatures along the way.
Beautiful. This is not a handle. This is where you have the conductivity, depth, and temperature sensor in here, and this is the dissolved oxygen.
The unit can find the warmest sections of water, which can intensify hurricanes.
Normally we dive to 900 meters, and it takes about 4 hours. So it's about 6 dives per day.
The drones collect data underwater and send it to computers like this using satellite radio waves.
So one of the things we want to know is when the glider goes into the water, if you look here, this is the actual track of what the glider did. And you see this is like almost a perfect V shape, which is what we strive for.
When the drones surface after each dive, they transmit their location to Yuli's computer, which shows up as those little dots between the lines.
So here is a map of where our gliders are right now. So we have gliders south of Puerto Rico, these 3 gliders right here, one south of the Dominican Republic, and one north of Puerto Rico.
While gliders take measurements underwater, sail drones track what's happening on the ocean's surface.
They want to get the sail drone to be at the same location as the glider. This way you have information from the surface down, and then also, atmospheric information, because the sail drones have the capability of doing that.
Built for extreme conditions, the robots are 23 feet long with a 15-foot wing that powers the drone and solar panels that power the sensors. These sensors test surface level temperature, wave height, wind speed, and salinity, or how fresh the water is.
And if they are fresh, we know that they will remain in the surface.
And if that water is also warm, it indicates a site that could intensify a hurricane. So one of Gustavo Goni's teams marks those areas on a map to keep an eye on. And when a hurricane is coming, the robots can sail straight into the storm.
But still, under those conditions, it has to conduct the observations and transmit them.
2022 was the first year that NOAA deployed gliders and sail drones to the same areas of the Atlantic. And this season, NOAA is adding super tough new aerial drones that can fly through the 200-mile-per-hour winds around the eye of a hurricane.
These drones provide us that information from the temperature, the relative humidity, the pressure information, wind speed and wind direction. All of those factors are key on how we understand how the hurricane is evolving. That data goes into the computer models so that we can better forecast what's going to happen the next day and so on.
Shirley Morello is in charge of the Hurricane Research Department at the lab. For years, Hurricane Hunter planes have flown above hurricanes to take measurements.
Oh, there goes the sun.
Today, aerial drones are launched from those planes, flying into the eye of the storm, giving experts a wealth of new data about how these monster storms intensify.
Hurricane intensity is a tough nut to crack. There are so many different pieces of the puzzle that need to be solved, from looking at the different layers of the atmosphere, from vertically to horizontally to different time scales.
From the air, scientists at these stations pilot the drones, gliding them like hawks into gale force winds, sometimes closer than 100 feet from the ocean's surface. Last year, NOAA flew this drone, the Altius 600, into the eye of a Category 4 hurricane for over 2 hours. But the drone crashed and wasn't recovered.
We experiment with aerial drones to see which one is going to give us the best information at the best time while we're flying in the storm. And so it's a trial and error.
For the 2023 season, NOAA is also using Black Swift S0 and Dragoon drones, with a new probe that can measure vertical winds, allowing researchers to predict how long a storm will last at its highest intensity. As NOAA scientists continue to chart the seas in anticipation of hurricanes, they see the information provided by drones as vital.
These data sets, whether it's in the ocean, under the water, or even in the air, they're a key piece for us to understand and forecast those storms.
I think it's pretty cool. Did you know that you can have a drone not fly? Did you know it could float and dive? It's pretty cool. I always thought about drones as something that's flying, but there are actually several of them that can transform as well. It's just pretty cool. LiDAR has also started being used more and more, which is a little bit more just accurate and just another piece of the puzzle when it comes to location-based drone usage. When it comes to powering them, I find it really interesting that the biggest limiting factor is 50%. You have to fly the drone somewhere, but also you need to get it back to you, right? That's a little bit of a problem if you're somewhere north of Uluru and you were just trying to get to something, and now you have wind going in an opposite direction, pushing against your drone. Do you think the drone's going to make it back? Probably not. So now there's lots of experimentation with how to power drones continuously. And one of them is, yes, a laser power transmitter. I understand that in this charging method, you have to use laser diodes of different wavelengths, to deliver power to PV cells that are integrated onto the UAV itself. Those harvest energy from the laser beams to charge the batteries or just deliver the required power directly to the UAV. So this is considered a promising approach by lots of testing measures, and it can deliver a lot of high energy very quickly, very rapidly. But apart from the different advantages of L2P systems, there are several critical issues such as mobility, blockage, limited performance on long distance flight, etc. And of course, this system is not exactly feasible in an airport. They would like you to not use laser beam. But it's still cool that this is a viable way. This is not just an experimentation phase. They are now executing it. This guy is pretty cool. That is the Turbojet Speed by Wave Aerospace. The Huntress 2 model can create a link range from your controller of about 30 kilometers. It's pretty crazy. It has kind of like four hybrid electric and fuel options. So not exactly the greenest one in the bunch, but they wanted to see how fast they could make a drone with a payload. And this payload is about 50 kilograms or about 110 pounds. So that's a significant thing that can be used to go very rapidly if you wanted to, I don't know, deliver a very hefty amount of fruit maybe to a mountaintop. That'd be cool. Also, it's the first one that's capable of Mach 0.4. That's pretty awesome. And of course, something like this is being tested definitely in much big, wide open spaces just to see how it can do. Across flat land, that's its fastest speed. Of course, the moment that you introduce any sort of mountains in the way or you have to climb, that will reduce your speed if you just know the basics of aerodynamics. But it's still pretty cool that this was recently built over the past year in the UK. And this is Evolve, who created the Sky Mantis, which is used together with an Infinity Power tether to allow it to hover and fly for 48 hours. And it's a long, basically like a really long power cable. Okay, but at any point in time, once it's charged up, it can magnetically just drop it and then go fly away. And of course, it would have to go again and recover the tether in order to charge up. But this is active. It's actually being used right now in the UK. You should definitely look into it if you're interested in, I don't know, never going to sleep when you're flying drones for 2 days. So what are we doing in Australia when it comes to the cool parts of drone delivery?
But where there's way less debate around viability is in long-range medical delivery. Australian operator Swoop Aero has been delivering medical supplies in Africa since launching in Malawi in March of 2020, and they've since expanded to other African countries, the UK, Ireland, Singapore, and the US. The company made history in early 2019, delivering vaccines to remote parts of Vanuatu.
At the moment, this is just a trial. What's being tested is whether this radical new solution is cost-effective and whether it can be scaled up.
Swoop says it's since delivered over 1.6 million items by drone globally and currently serves 4.5 million people, with the aim to grow that number to 1 billion by 2030.
Drone delivery has been around for a long time at the moment, but it's typically been used for kind of novel things. You know, we've seen some companies are delivering like roast chickens and coffees. Some companies have tried delivering pizzas. I'm not a proponent of the sky is black with drones. It's not a reality. There's going to be hundreds of drones flying around delivering all kinds of things. It's going to be very specific use cases, and it's about augmenting the drone technology into the existing transport and services infrastructure to fundamentally change how that whole system operates.
There are many reasons why Swoop and Zipline have focused so much on Africa. Poor road infrastructure, massive distances, and less dense airspace are all factors that make drone delivery a fast and cost-effective option. But the inherent value of delivering essential medical items is the most important factor.
We do about 2 emergency deliveries a week, and that can range from anything for oxytocin from mother that's just given birth at a hospital in central Malawi, through to blood plasma, or even things like rabies vaccines for someone that's been bitten by a rabid dog.
Zipline's operations in Rwanda particularly have helped transform the country's healthcare system. A report published in the Science Robotics Journal found Zipline's delivery of blood in Rwanda had reduced the mortality of new mothers suffering postpartum hemorrhaging by 51% and reduced the exploration of blood by 67%. Rwanda has now greatly expanded the application of drones in its airspace to include the delivery of agricultural products, e-commerce, and potentially a new national postal service centered around drones.
Zipline has spent 7 years driving down the unit economic cost curve of this kind of technology, going from a place where it was really, really expensive and only made sense for the most desperate healthcare emergencies to a place where today it is net less expensive than doing a similar delivery using a car or a motorcycle.
Zipline and Swoop say they're both financially viable businesses today, and that a lot of that can be credited to the value of medical delivery versus more novel last mile items. And Swoop has now expanded into Australia, establishing a regional medical delivery network in the state of Queensland, which they say is the largest of its kind in a high-income country. Phase 1 of the network is currently in operation with regulatory approval for an area of 40,000 square kilometres. People living within this network are able to order medical items like prescriptions and lab results, expanding healthcare services to regional and remote populations. A second phase is awaiting approval, which would expand the coverage area to a massive patch of southern Queensland. Swoop says that this network could one day extend into Brisbane's metro area as well, connecting a major city to its regional neighbours.
There's this new opportunity to leverage the sky to create value for society. And so whether we're talking about equitable access to healthcare for people in regional areas, so the 2 million Australians who don't live within an hour of a hospital, or the 60 million Americans that don't live within an hour of a pharmacy, or whether we're talking about how to decarbonise a metro logistics network by picking the 10% of locations that add 50% of the road kilometres and taking them out to help us get toward net zero by 2030. That's kind of how we can add value back with this technology.
Yeah, so that's what you're all up to now, just in this country. Quite a leader, actually, in drone technology. You have a lot of room to do it, right? And you have a lot of very smart technologists. It's an exciting industry to be in, especially right now, because now that there's going to be more cooperation between regulators now, it's going to pave the way to make things a little bit easier and use drones for their probably intended purpose. They can't do everything, but they could do certain things better than what we've had to do in the past, as you see. So basically, I want this takeaway to be, they're here to stay. They're not just a novelty. They're actually used for good things for civilians too. And if you're interested in working on any sort of software with them, you're always welcome to hit me up, and I'm happy to connect you with different companies that are looking. But in the future, it isn't just going to be drones. It's going to be different kinds of sensors. And that's always going to be what the bane of our existence is. More data in and out. I have faith in our industry, though. So thank you for staying with me as I kind of explained a little bit about Remote AD and where we're going. Cheers.